Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to discuss some of the recent discoveries about the most fascinating creatures on the planet, bacteria. And specifically we're going to discuss an unusual series of discoveries regarding their social lives. And as you can probably tell from the video's title, very bizarre discoveries in regards to their communication. And that's because for a very long time, scientists actually believed that bacteria were more or less primitive and usually preferred solitary lives. They were basically busy consuming nutrients, growing, dividing, and generally lived somewhat boring lives. But in the last few years, this assumption has been proven to be incorrect. As a matter of fact, solitary life for bacteria seems to be an extremely rare exception, because most bacteria seem to be very social, and they even display a kind of an unusual type of intelligence that we've previously discussed in some of the previous videos, but we'll also be discussing in some of the future videos in the next few months. And so here they're able to coordinate their actions and even act like an enormous multicellular organism, performing tasks that would be practically impossible if they were just a single cell. But in order to make all of this work, they of course have to somehow communicate. And as we've learned in the last few years, turns out their communication can be pretty complex and involve a lot of different components. But the foundation of our understanding of bacterial communication is usually based on a process referred to as quorum sensing. This was actually first observed back in the 1980s, and it was seen in marine bacteria or cyanobacteria that are also known to produce bioluminescence or light. And so here scientists noticed that these bacteria would only glow when they reached a high population density. And so basically they only start glowing when they reach certain numbers, but more importantly, when they can sense each other through very specific means. And so here, based on years of research, scientists discovered that they are able to do so chemically. They discovered that these bacteria release small molecules called autoinducers, although here I guess you can think of them as chemical votes, that increase in density as bacteria increase in numbers. And so once the concentration of these molecules becomes high enough, and once a certain threshold is reached, the bacteria then basically kind of counts these votes, I guess, and dramatically changes their behavior. And they do so in unison, all at the same time. In this case, their behavior involves turning on the lights. But in many other cases, this quorum sensing results in additional types of behavior that's also been observed many times in the last few years. For example, in some cases, they actually start building structures, often referred to as biofilms, and in other cases, they actually change their behavior and, for example, may start attacking something or do the opposite and become passive. And so here, this very unusual chemical communication seems to dramatically change what bacteria do. But crucially, it was also discovered that these bacteria seem to be multilingual in a sense. And specifically, when it comes to talking to their own species, they use a kind of a private language using what's known as autoinducer 1. One good and somewhat important example here is what's known as cholera autoinducer 1. This serves as a key signaling molecule for the Vibrio cholera, the bacterium responsible for cholera. And this is basically the language this bacteria uses to coordinate group behavior. And so when there is a low concentration of this molecule, it generally promotes the formation of biofilm in order to survive different environmental conditions. But as soon as the high density of this molecule is reached, or basically as soon as there are a lot of cholera cells around, it stops producing biofilm and instead aids bacterial dispersion, which basically then makes this bacteria extremely virulent and infectious. And so here this molecule is really important for controlling cholera. And in case you're wondering, this is what cholera's language looks like. But a lot of bacteria also have something known as autoinducer 2. And this is a kind of a universal or trade language that's used to talk to other different species of bacteria. And here this actually allows for a diverse community of microbes to then start doing something together and to even affect its environment as a group, deciding on different group tasks. With all of this usually being done with just two types of molecules. And with even these two molecules, it already gets super complicated. But surprisingly, this is just one of many ways bacteria communicate. Because communication here is not just chemical. Some of the recent studies discovered they can also build physical bridges made of various nanotubes and membranes. And in many cases, these structures act like tunnels, allowing different microbes to link together and to then coexist as a group, while also transferring a lot of stuff inside those tunnels. And through these tunnels, bacteria of different types engage in a sophisticated trade network, sharing different proteins, amino acids, and nutrients, and basically allowing all of them to benefit from a single source of nutrients. This actually allows a lot of simpler bacteria to receive essential materials they would not be able to produce themselves. And this has now been detected in a lot of different types of bacteria, and we've discussed this in one of the previous videos in the description. But basically this makes entire communities much more resilient, allowing them to survive pretty much anything, even outer space. But the point of this video was to discuss something entirely different. A new type of a communication system that was recently discovered in a study in the description. And so here researchers behind this study discovered that certain cyanobacteria can also communicate in a very similar way to how we communicate using radio. In other words, they basically discover a kind of an AM radio of the microscopic world. And this is one of the most striking recent discoveries involving bacterial information processing and involving any communication in any species. But specifically this focuses on cyanobacteria, some of the oldest bacteria on the planet, responsible for producing a major portion of Earth's oxygen and for making our lives just a little bit easier. And turns out that some of these single-cell organisms can regulate their genes using the same physical principles that we usually find inside radio transmission, and specifically AM radio transmission. Okay, let's just briefly review how this works. In a typical AM radio, information is transmitted by varying the strength or amplitude of a specific wavelength. This is of course slightly different from the more commonly used FM radio, which uses frequency modulation. And so based on the study, scientists discovered that cyanobacteria seem to use a very similar mechanism, now referred to as pulse amplitude modulation. And they do this to coordinate their internal 24-hour circadian clock with their cell division cycle. And well, here's exactly how this seems to work. In this case, bacterial cell division seems to act as a kind of a carrier signal, and their internal clock seems to act as the modulating signal. And to discover this, researchers tracked a very specific protein referred to as RPO-D4. This protein pulses every single time a bacterial cell divides. But they discovered that the internal clock seems to dictate how strong these pulses are depending on the time of the day. And by modulating the pulse strength, bacteria can then encode two different types of information in a single output. The first type of information records the timing from the 24-hour clock, and the second type of information encodes the growth from the cell cycle, which then allows bacteria to maintain a very consistent 24-hour rhythm, even if they're dividing much faster or much slower due to various environmental changes, like for example light levels. And this seems to be a remarkably elegant engineering solution for an organism that evolved 2.7 billion years ago. And so basically here, by having two repeating clocks, one for the cell cycle and one for the circadian clock, this bacteria can then send two separate messages at once. For example, one of the messages can be how far along am I in division, which is usually seen in the frequency of pulses, and the other message can be what time of a day is it. This is the amplitude pulse, which can then be of course sensed by all of the bacteria near them that can then join in and do the same. And this is extremely important for a lot of these bacteria because many processes inside of them have to be timed accurately in order to work efficiently. For example, in order to know exactly when to photosynthesize, a bacteria has to somehow time the 24-hour cycle, even if they're somewhere deep in the water and are unable to see anything. At the same time, they also have to know exactly when to divide and when to, for example, repair damage. And so here this is an elegant solution that mostly uses internal communication cycles, but is actually meant to track the external day-night environment because these bacteria directly depend on the sun for their survival. Although in this case, this is mostly an intracellular communication, basically within one cell, and not bacteria talking to neighbors like in quorum sensing. In other words, even though other bacteria can probably sense this, at the moment we only have evidence for the communication inside a cell. Nevertheless, understanding these mechanisms and these conversations is vital for many different fields of biology. And I guess the biggest one is of course medicine. And that's because most bacteria seem to have extremely similar mechanisms, and for example can control their own virulence or how infectious they become by using many of these internal mechanisms, including quorum sensing and protein modulation. As a matter of fact, in many cases, the infectious bacteria generally do not start the infection process until there are enough bacteria in the same environment and until they communicate with each other and start attacking the body. And since today there's a bit of a problem when it comes to antibiotics, with many different bacteria even developing immunity to them, this is of course the case of the multi-drug resistance and the appearance of superbugs. Here, by trying to learn exactly how they communicate, and by understanding their language, we can then start producing medicine that instead of killing bacteria, basically just tells them not to do anything. So we can either jam their signals, or even ask them nicely to just go somewhere else. And even if they don't leave our bodies, eventually our immune system is going to clear them out. And furthermore, when it comes to this radio-like communication, this can even help us understand photosynthesis a little bit better, and possibly even help us develop crops that are more resilient and more efficient. So basically here, by understanding how this works, we can then improve the biological clock inside different plants and help them photosynthesize better. But here we also have to remember that, unlike us, bacteria had billions of years of head start to basically develop and master all sorts of different types of communication. And so these types of discoveries are just basically scratching the surface. It's quite likely that in the next few years we're going to discover so many more means of communication bacteria seem to have, with many other studies basically tackling the idea behind bacterial intelligence that we're going to be discussing very soon. And so as we continue to decode these secrets of bacteria, this will probably help us discover additional complex rules of life and a lot of different functions that we never knew existed, because we never really looked at bacteria in so much detail before. On that note, that's pretty much all I wanted to mention, but we'll definitely come back and discuss this in some of the future videos. Until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support the channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can game it directly, or by joining a channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.